Hi there, Squirrelmob here. Today I'd like to give you one nut's perspective on companions. In 2020, we got the set Ikoria. And Ikoria featured 10 different companions. What companions are these cards that have the ability Companion, which means that they have a restriction in deck building. And if you meet that restriction, you can play the card from outside the game. Now, originally you could play it directly from outside the game. Now you have to pay 3 to put it in your hand, and then you can play it. But in either case, these cards were printed to kind of give a commander feel to non-commander formats. Here's the problem with that. Turns out it was busted. Now, I'm not going to talk about companions in 60-card formats. We know that they were nuts there, especially a couple of them. I want to talk about companions in Commander. Specifically because Commander's rules changed to make companions fit. It did only require one word being added to the rule regarding outside the game. It used to say cards that bring cards from outside the game don't function in EDH, and now it says cards that bring other cards from outside the game don't function in EDH. So companions function because they only bring themselves in. Here's the thing, though. I don't think the RC should have made that decision. Now, this is just my personal opinion. You're welcome to disagree, but I'm going to lay out my reasons why. So these are the 10 companions we've got. We've got 5 that are in allied colors and 5 that are in enemy colors. We see that they've got hybrid mana costs, and that makes them really attractive for 60-card play. Because it turns out you can cast them with whatever you've got, right? You can be in any deck running some combination of blue or white and play Yorion. And we've seen Yorion get used in lots of ways in different 60-card formats. Some of them with blue, some of them with white, some of them with both blue and white. And that's kind of cool. But in EDH, is it as cool? Are any of these as cool in EDH as they might be in a standard 60-card deck? Do they function in EDH like they function in Modern or Legacy? For my opinion on EDH and Companions, I want to look at a few different aspects of these cards. And I'm going to break them down one by one. So let's start with Yorion. And there are 3 things that I want to look at when it comes to Yorion. His restriction. Its restriction. And Yorion's restriction gets an F. It gets an F for a very simple reason. Yorion's restriction doesn't work within the rules of EDH. It doesn't function. So Yorion doesn't work as a companion in EDH. The others do. But Yorion doesn't. That makes it an F. It just doesn't work. The second thing I want to look at is how creative it is. What I mean by that is, how interesting is the payoff for what the card does, right? So if you're building your deck around this restriction, you want to have some sort of interesting thing to do with it. And if we look at Yorion's ability, right, when it enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you own and control, return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. That's not that interesting. It's really not, right? The defense of companions is that they make things, they give us interesting ways to both build our decks and interesting reasons to do it. I would contend that Yorion's restriction is not that interesting, and it doesn't work in EDH, so it doesn't really even matter. But I also would say that its ability isn't that interesting either. Now the question is the payoff, is the power level of this worthwhile? If people could build a Yorion deck, would they? And the answer to this is a resounding yes. It gets an A+ there, right? Yorion is honestly probably reasonable just as a commander, because it's a perfectly reasonable blink commander, right? That's an archetype that people already play. They want to blink things, they want to bounce their permanents and have them come back into play and use these 1/8/7 effects. And Yorion does that really well. Which brings me to the overall Rating, does it make Commander better? I give Yorion a D. I don't think it does. I think it does in that it's a card that provides a little bit of interesting ability as a commander, but you can't use it as a companion, which doesn't help at all. And it's not that interesting an ability. It just blinks a bunch of stuff, which, do we really need another mass blink effect? Not really. Do we need a mass blink effect on a commander? Not really. I mean, we've got things that do that already, and maybe they don't do them as well as Yorion, but it being a creature even means that you can blink it to reuse its blink. That's probably not actually healthy. The second is Garuda, Doom of Depths. Its restriction gets a B from me. Starting a deck with only even converted mana costs, even mana values, that's honestly pretty neat. It's kind of cool, and it takes some planning and effort to do that. That's pretty interesting. Now, its ability here says when it comes into play or it enters the battlefield, each player mills 4 cards, and then you put a creature card with an even mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. So, is that ability interesting? Well, it's a blue-black card. It's milling things and reanimating things and doing them together. It's a blue-black card. If you had told me that it does that, yeah, okay, that's what blue-black cards do. It's not that interesting. It's really not. Is the payoff worth it? Absolutely. So, is the card healthy for EDH? Does it actually provide a benefit? I don't actually think it does. It's a little better than Yorion. But the main way that it gets used is either as an additional reanimation effect on a creature. That isn't necessarily needed. It could get used as a combo piece with a bunch of clones in your deck. That's probably not great either. It's slightly more interesting as a commander than as a companion. But I'll be honest, it's not that interesting a card either. 0 for 2 right now on things that actually seem like they do a good job improving the format, in my eyes. Let's take a look at Obash. Obash is kind of the mirror image of Garuda. It wants odd converted mana costs, and it also says you can play lands, because 0 is even. And it says, if a source you control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. So, is the restriction reasonable? Yeah. Much like Garuda, I give this a B. It takes some actual planning and putting together and ideas that are kind of cool and lead to an interesting way to do things. The creativity, though, gets a D. It's a Furnace of Wrath effect. Like, okay, that's not particularly unique. It's not particularly stunning. It's not particularly surprising. And as a payoff, it's pretty good, right? So we've got another one of these abilities that gives us a really bland effect that's really, really good for what you're doing. Now, I will say, Obash does make Commander a little better. Why? Well, because having this kind of effect on a creature, it's boring, but it does provide a little bit of an oomph to aggro decks. I actually think it's better as a commander than a companion. Again, another one of these, which isn't great for the idea of companion here, right? But as a commander, this lets you build in other aggro pieces, and then it makes all your 1 drops and all your 3 drops and all your 5 drops a little stronger. That's pretty cool if you put it with the right stuff. Then we have Gigantha. Jeggy. Jeggy's restriction, it's not that interesting. It's really not. No card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol and mana cost. You do lose some interesting cards by doing that. But there's a lot of things that you don't. There's a lot of things that you can play just perfectly fine with it around. creativity on it, what it does, also not good. It's a mana dork. Seriously, it's a mana dork. Why are we going out of our way to build around a mana dork? Now, I realize that this is probably going to earn me a blood feud from our favorite AI Rebel, but I'll be honest, Gigantha isn't that interesting as a card to me. Now, again, this is just my personal opinion, but it's not great. And is the payoff worth the restriction? Sort of, I guess, if you really want it. Like, Rebels built their Sisay deck around Gigantha, which works, but like, okay. I mean, it's a cool deck, but Sisay can exist without it too. And Gigantha as a commander turns out is pretty good too, because you don't have to have that restriction, and then you've just got a big fat mana dork in the command zone. So does it make commander better? Not really. It's interesting. But here's the problem with it, right? The real problem with Gigantha, more than anything else, is that it just doesn't work well with the rules commander. Like, all the companions, in my opinion, don't. But Gigantha doesn't because it only works in 5-color decks. Like, it's cool that people have figured out, that Rebel has figured out a way to use this in a way that skirts the restriction and makes it not a big deal. But it's disappointing to me that in a cycle of cards where 2 of them already don't function the way they're intended to in Commander, this one is further locked and only functions in 1 color identity worth of decks. So the cycle of 2 color cards, 3 of the color combinations, 3 of the guilds are cut out of it, which I think is worse for Commander overall. But maybe some of the other companions do a better job. Let's take a look. So here we have Kahira. Kahira's companion ability requires you to have either every creature in your deck being a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast. It's tribal. It's extreme tribal, but it's building tribal decks. Many people build their tribal decks this way already, just usually not with these creature types. Its ability also isn't that creative. Each other creature you control that's a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast gets +1/+1 and has vigilance. It's a tribal lord. Okay, cool. It's not interesting at all, in my opinion. And is it worth it? If you build your entire deck out of these cards, is it worth it to have this card in your companion zone? Honestly, probably not. Like, it's not that strong an ability, and you're giving up other cards that can help those creatures be stronger in your deck, right? You can give up cards that have cross-tribe synergies in order to run this. I don't think that's doing a whole lot for you. So does it make Commander better? No, it doesn't. Honestly, I think this is the worst companion for Commander other than Lutri. And Lutri's only because it has to be banned. Like, I think Kahira is just not positive for the format. I don't think it is. I don't think the restriction is interesting. I don't think that the ability is in any way interesting as well. And I think that combination of things makes it just really boring. Going into the enemy colors, first one up we have Lurrus of the Dream Den. Lurrus's companion ability says that each permanent in your deck has to have a CMC 2 or less. That's a pretty reasonable restriction. It's not impossible, though. And Lurrus, for reasons that are fairly obvious, I think, really caused problems in 60-card formats, including Vintage and Legacy, and to a certain extent it's been kind of a problem in Modern too. Because it turns out that in formats where you want to go fast, most of your permanents already don't cost more than 2. And and its ability to bring back those permanents in a black-white card, again, not particularly creative. If you said, I'm going to create a black-white creature that brings back CMC 2 or less spells, or 2 or less permanents, you can play one from your graveyard each turn, there's no reason this needed to be a companion. There's no reason that this ability couldn't have been on any old black-white legend. Like, that's kind of just dull. And that's fine. Like, it hits the points of a black-white card. It's just not, in my opinion, interesting enough to make up for the problems that these cards introduce to Commander. Now, the payoff for the restriction works beautifully, right? That's why it's such a problem in Vintage and Legacy and Modern. Like, that's why it's a problem. It's because the payoff is so good. So does it make Commander better? No, it doesn't. Right? Lurrus actually impacted a rules change in Commander as well. Not just as companion, but Lurrus led to the decoupling of the Vintage ban list and the Commander ban list. Now, to be fair, that probably is a non-factor, but to have one card kind of be the impetus for that thing happening, I don't think is particularly healthy. So, not great. Then we have Lutri. Lutri's restriction for Commander is an F because it's not a restriction at all in Commander. It is straight up the way that Commander works. The creativity on what it does, also not particularly interesting, right? It's a blue-red creature that copies an instant or sorcery spell you control when you cast it. Or when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it. It's not a cast trigger. If it was a cast trigger, it might be slightly more interesting. But it's an enter the battlefield trigger, but only if you cast it. I know some people who are really excited for Lutri to potentially be a commander because they didn't read the if you cast it part. Because they thought it would be like Dual Caster Mage where you could combo it off with something like Twin Flame. You can't do that. And it turns out that a lot of people I knew who were really excited about this were then much less excited about it. But I still know people who are really, really excited about it. Now, is the payoff worth the restriction? In EDH, absolutely it would be, right? Because it's a free card to play if you are playing EDH, right? The restriction is non-existent. And so if the restriction is non-existent, any payoff is worth it, right? This could be a 3-2, and it would be fine, right? That payoff would be good because there's no cost to playing it whatsoever. So is it healthy for Commander? Does it make Commander better? No, it doesn't. That's why it's banned. And it being banned also isn't particularly healthy for Commander. Think about how many people are upset about this card not being able to be played because look at him. All right, look at his cute little paws and his little ball of energy, right? It's a cute card. People want to play cute cards. But the fact that it doesn't work, that's just kind of a bummer. Next up is Umori the Collector. Little oozy guy. I don't know where its face is. It might be the part on the right. It might be the part on the left. It might... I don't know. Maybe the crystals are the face. That would be weird because it's collecting the crystals. But, you know, whatever. So, we've got Umori. And Umori says, as a companion, each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type. That's a very impactful restriction. The reason it doesn't get an A here is because if you want Umori to be your commander, or if you want Umori to be your companion, there are literally only 3 types that your deck can be. It can either be creatures, artifacts, or enchantments. And if it's artifacts, you've got to be playing him with an artifact creature commander, which is at least green-black, which means like Ramos now. Rip Golos. If it's an enchantment, it's got to be an enchantment creature, which I think is literally just Farika, or it's got to be just a creature in general. So the restriction is meaningful because it's kind of a double restriction if you want to play it as companion and commander, because it means that either you're playing all creatures, all artifacts, or maybe all enchantments. Now, when we look at it, when it comes into play, you choose a card type. Spells of the chosen type that you cast cost 1 less. That's a D-, right? It makes spells cheaper. it's not that interesting, right? You've built a deck around these types of cards, and now it makes them all cheaper. You've got a deck full of these things, and if you have this dude in play, it just becomes easier to play them. That's not terribly interesting. But is it good? Yeah, it's okay. It's not great. I'm not writing home about it, but it's fine. That's as a companion. As a commander, I actually think Umori is incredibly interesting, which is why I'm going to give it a C for doesn't make commander better. I actually think this card is a sweet commander. If you want to play this card as your commander and build around it and kind of have a little more flexibility, that's awesome. I think there's a lot of cool things you can do with it. As a companion, I just think it kind of sucks. Which is why, up until a couple days ago, I don't think anybody had been talking about Umori as a companion. I've seen some chatter about it recently, but not a lot. Because, well, meh. It's not a great companion. Which is unfortunate, because this little guy, a lot of people say that Lutri's cute, but Umori's pretty cute too. Again, you don't know where his head is, but you know, he's kind of cute, oozy dude. Anyways, next up is Zerta, the Dawn Waker. Zerta also has been pretty good in some other formats. I believe at one point it was banned in Legacy because it was too good there. And it says each permanent in your card has an activated ability, or each permanent card in your library has an activated ability. That's your companion starting restriction. And that's a B. There's a lot of meaningful choices you can make with that. There's a lot of good cards you miss out on if you choose to build around this card as your companion. And its ability here makes it so that activated abilities that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate, but it can't make it less than 1. So it's kind of like a Hearthstone ability, but for all activated abilities. The problem is that's also not creative at all. Like, you're building a deck around activated abilities, and now they're just cheaper to use, which turns it into a giant combo engine. That's what this guy is. A giant combo engine that's a fox. I guess kind of a fiery fox, because it's an elemental too. Now, that payoff, is it worth it? Yeah. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is banned in Legacy because it turns out it's too good with things like Basalt Monolith and Grim Monolith. That's not great. So it's really easy to make infinite mana with Zerta, and it's really easy to turn that infinite mana into something else, which brings us to the question, is that good for Commander? Not really. I'm going to give it a C- here instead of a D, though, because it's a Boros card. And when it was printed, there weren't a ton of compelling Boros commanders. This one is actually somewhat compelling as a commander. I don't think it's terribly compelling as a companion, but as a commander, yeah, it's pretty okay. The last of them is Kuruga. Now, what I'm going to say here is probably going to get me a blood feud from Chef Nathan, so that'll be fun. I have 2 blood feuds. Now, Kuruga says your starting deck contains cards with CMC 3 or greater and lands. It's B+ restriction. It's honestly probably the best restriction of any of the cards that have companion. It is interesting. It does require real deck building choices. And it plays into what EDH wants to be as a format, right? If you talk about big, splashy plays, people interacting a whole bunch, if you're handicapping yourself by running only things that cost 3 or more, that's straight up like right in the vein of what EDH wants to do. Creativity, though, gets a D- from me. It's a blue-green card. It comes into play. It draws cards. Yawn. That is what blue and green do. Did they really need that to be their companion, too? It's just not terribly exciting. Is the payoff worth the restriction? Yeah, I suppose. You do make some real deck-building sacrifices, which means you do get to draw some cards. But then you're drawing a bunch of more expensive cards to play. Now, are there ways that you can make this pretty busted? Yeah. That's why Chef Nathan is probably going to get me on a blood feud here, given that his Sakadama deck runs Kuruga as a companion and does all sorts of nutty things by using Kodama's trigger to get new things into play and cheat on those mana costs, because when everything costs 3 or more, you probably want to be cheating on mana costs. Now, is that healthy for Commander? No, it's not. A combination of a blue-green card that draws a bunch of cards and wants you to build in a way that cheats on mana costs, those aren't things that I think make Commander better. Those are things that either keep it the same or maybe even detract from it some. And I don't think that's great. So in summary, I don't like companions. You've probably figured that out. They do have some good things. They provide potential deck building restrictions. That's kind of cool. They provide payoffs to build around strategies. That's also pretty neat. And they do have some compelling flavor. That I do appreciate. The idea that you are bonding with these beasties from the wilds of Ikoria, that's kind of cool. That's alright. So we have some things here that make the companions potentially fun. That's nice. But in my mind, there's a lot of cons. The restrictions by themselves, most of them aren't that compelling. Some of them are. Some of them are pretty interesting. I think Obash and Kuruga and Gyruda all have pretty interesting restrictions. I feel like most of the others, their restrictions aren't necessarily that compelling, though. And the other thing is, I think many of them aren't necessarily restrictions that people haven't explored beforehand on their own, right? I mean, think about, for example, Kahira. I mean, when we're talking about building a tribal deck and building it all creatures of one tribe, that's not a novel restriction. That's something that people have done for years. It's not interesting. The payoffs are almost always uninspired. They are things that we would expect to see and induce yawns. A Furnace of Wrath effect, a reanimation effect, a mana dork, card draw, recursion. Okay, cool. Not particularly interesting. 8 out of the 10 of these are compelling commanders in their own right without companion. I think all of these cards, with the exception of Lutri and Kahira, are pretty interesting just as commanders, right? If you played a Kuruga deck just with Kuruga as a commander, I don't think it's terribly interesting, but it's cool, right? You're playing a hippo, awesome. I think Obash is a sweet commander on its own. I think Gyruda is a pretty cool commander on its own. Even Jegantha's kind of okay as a commander on its own. As companions, they don't need that help. One of them just doesn't work too, right? Yorion can't be a commander. Or it can't be a companion. Sorry, it can be a commander, but it can't be a companion. That's not cool. That's kind of boring. One of them has to be banned in commander. You can't have Lutri running around because it was be ubiquitous. That sucks. That's not interesting. It's not fun. And if the argument is that companions are fun, having 2 of them not work, that's a B minus at best. If we're saying companions are fun and 2 of them don't work. This also plays into the color identity rule. When you have a blue-white companion that doesn't work, you have a blue-red companion that's banned, and you have a green-red companion that in Commander has to be a 5-color companion, that means that only 7 of the 10 guilds have companions that work. That's not particularly interesting either. Even if we ignore deck restrictions, the color identity rule here makes it so that monocolored decks never get a companion. Even if you wanted to have one, you can't have one. which isn't interesting to me. 2, because of those other rules, 5-color decks, again, have the most ability to choose things here. Whereas 2-color decks, you only get 1 or none. 3-color decks, you might get a few to choose from if you wanted to. And 4-color decks basically have the run of the gauntlet here. But 5-color decks, again, have access to everything. That's already a problem in Commander. Companions aren't a huge way that exacerbates that problem, but they do exacerbate that problem, right? There are already so many reasons that building a 5-color commander is interesting and compelling because of the color identity rule. And making companion another potential piece of that, I think, is unhealthy overall compared to what they add. Also, Commander talks about being a format where variance is part of the flavor and the feel of the format. And yet, the Commander Rules Committee went out of their way to say, we're going to allow this piece of extra consistency that's not only an extra piece of consistency, but is an extra piece of consistency specifically for the way you are building your deck, because you have to build the deck in a certain way to have that extra piece of consistency for it. That feels counterintuitive to the philosophy of the format. Yes, there is an argument to be made that restrictions breed creativity, but at the same time, having the payoff be always available for the restriction feels like a way that it feels like a thing that isn't really healthy to include in the format. And of course, again, only 9 of them work, right? 1 has to be banned, only 9 work. That just isn't good. The last piece here is that these are not future-proofed. What I mean by that is, if Wizards were to ever make more companions, these companions and the way that they have been introduced don't necessarily, because they work in Commander, they don't necessarily protect Commander from anything that might be printed again in the future. It's entirely possible. Now, I don't think that Wizards would do this, but it's entirely possible they could print a commander or a companion with the same restriction as Lutri that would have to be banned right out of the gate. It's entirely possible they could print more companions that just don't work in Commander. Now, do I think that's likely? No. I think it's more likely that we never see Companion come back again, to be completely honest, which would probably be for the best. But the other issue with future-proofing here is that the design space that Wizards has been playing around with here, the outside the game design space, has been utilized more. And when the Rules Committee changed the rule that impacts outside the game cards to make it so that companions work, it was the first time that rule had been changed in quite a long time, basically since it existed. And it immediately made some people say, well, what about wishes? And what about, these pieces of other cards? And so we've had to have multiple reiterations of that rule, multiple clarifications on that rule in rules updates, even though the rule hasn't changed. There have been, I think, that was April of 2020, so there's been 4, 5, I think, rules updates since then, and I think in fully 3 of them, the rule had to have additional clarifications added. There had to be a clarification added for dungeons. There had to be a clarification added for the learn mechanic. There had to be a clarification added for the card Wish. And there had to be a clarification added for parts of cards. So like Karn, the one from War of the Spark, I forget what the title it has is, but the Karn from War of the Spark or Sponsire and Ulamog, they all had clarifications made in the rules. I don't think any of that would have happened if companions weren't able to work in EDH. And I think that it is more likely than not that there will be more cards that push that design space that make the RC either have to keep reiterating this rule over and over again because it no longer is as simple as it was, or they're going to have to keep reconsidering whether to change it or not. And I think that's a hole that they walked into on their own accord. That's kind of their own fault for doing it. And I think that it also undermines a lot of things that they say. Frequently they talk about how they don't make rules changes for corner cases. Yet here we have, in effect, 8 cards who got a rules change for just those 8 cards, whereas there are 40-something cards, maybe 30 or so, 30 or 40 cards that aren't companions, that reference outside the game, that have part or all of their functionality taken away. Even if we just look at the cards with the wish effects, there are 5 wishes from Judgment, there's Glittering Wish from Time Spiral, there's Ring of Maroof. That's 7 cards right there that don't work versus 8 cards that do work with Companion. Already that seems like it's kind of corner casey, just a little bit. And so it also undermines, in my opinion, the arguments the RC makes in making certain decisions when they have, in effect, made a corner case work here. And I know that the response to this is, well, companions are fun. Okay, for some people they are, and for some people they aren't. I provided a little bit of my thoughts here, and you can probably tell from those thoughts that I don't think companions are fun. And that's fine. Like, what I find fun doesn't have to be what you find fun. But I think overall, I think they provide more problems than they answer. I think they provide more issues than the positives they bring to the format. Now, do I expect this to change? No, I don't. Do I expect this to do anything? Not really. I expect this to probably piss off a couple people and get me some angry comments. So if you want to leave your angry comments, feel free to do so below. You can also hit me up on social media, on Twitter, and that's linked in the description here, and you can leave me angry comments there too. If you thought that this was interesting, or you want to be informed the next time I leave one of these and so you can leave angry comments again, make sure you hit subscribe, make sure you ring that bell, as they say, to get notifications, and hopefully you thought this was at least a little bit interesting. See you next time.